All right. Welcome everyone. So, again, I don't really, I've already admitted this. I think it's some recent videos that I don't really enjoy I don't really enjoy doing YouTube videos that much anymore. Um, at least my own. I'm not really that much of a fan of doing them. Um, but I guess I can just use this space to think about thoughts that I haven't really fleshed out. Um, which is weird to say because I feel like with writing, anyways, I like to just kind of free associate a little bit with an idea. Um, but I noticed with this topic that I'm going to talk about specifically, um, religion, um, no, religion, religious theory, the secularization thesis, why I prefer the Hegelian notion over religious theory, which I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. Um, so yeah, let's just go there. Um, so some of you know, maybe some of you don't, but I'm going to school and I'm like I'm a religious studies major, right? Um, and so what's kind of shoved down my throat is that we don't really know what we're talking about when we're talking about religion. You know what I mean? And and so that's kind of the problem with talking about a kind of secularization. Like, the talking about the world is becoming secularized, right? Um, but I've been thinking about this in perhaps a very Hegelian fashion, meaning that whatever is secular seems to be whatever we know in predication, like in relation to about religion, right? It seems to be whatever we like saying what secularization is tantamount to saying what religion is. That's how deeply related to each other they are in a kind of dialectical fashion. Um, so yeah, so there's a couple of things we could talk about there, but I think when I talk about secularization, I don't mean capital, and I don't mean a bunch of other things. I mean specifically what people call the secularization thesis. The secularization thesis is this basically ambiguous assertion that we are becoming less and less religious, um, whatever that means, really. Um, so we're becoming less and less religious. But I feel like, in my opinion, and this is perhaps my Hegelian interpretation of secularization, is that I think secularization is almost like just pure negativity. Like it's just pure negativity, I think, to some degree. I think people want to talk about capitalism in secularization, and that's true. I think that's a very historical take, or a very historical point. Um, and there's room for that conversation. Um, but perhaps it might be better to talk about the fact that the secularization thesis is this idea that there's a sort of decreasing amount of religiosity and more increase of secularization. And that's a very ambiguous, when you really think about it, that's a very ambiguous thing. And what do we mean by becoming less religious? As if less religiosity is something that can be empirically, objectively tested, seen. We have problems if we're saying like people are not going to church, and that means we're becoming less religious? Or is it the fact that we have now become religious in a different way and we can't use the same methods we did before to kind of judge this assertion? So those are the problems that we kind of come across when we're talking about secularization thesis. I'm basically playing with this idea. The secularization thesis is asserting kind of increase of secularization and less religiosity. Funny enough, what's interesting to me is a lot of religious rhetoric or a lot of discourse within religions themselves is this kind of fear mongering over less religiosity, the losing of something. Um, and you could say those that are secular are, on the other side, a fear of the world becoming more religious. I believe it was, I think, is it Ruth Stein? I don't know if it's Ruth Stein. I don't want to say E.S. Stein because I think that's another philosopher, but I think Ruth Stein, neo-Freudian, um, she definitely pushed back on this idea of the secularization thesis. She actually thought the world was becoming more and more religious, and that had to do with her studies on her kind of Freudian interpretations on kind of Islamic fundamentalism and just fundamentalism in general. Specifically, probably she mainly focused on the Abrahamic religions. Um, so there's that, um, and there's a lot to think about. But what I want to get at is religion as a term, and this is what's kind of like was kind of I'm always constantly reminded of this in some ways, is that religion as a term, we have to be very careful about what we call religion and not religion, right? And the one criteria that religious studies likes to use is, well, religion, the term itself, is a 17th century word, right? So now it really obfuscates what the hell are we talking about when we call something a religion, and what are we calling, right? And so when I took my um, Roman and Greek religion class, um, Denova, the one that wrote the book, spent a lot of time trying to preface the fact that we would be hard pressed to call these religions, because religion already seems to, in some sense, play with the fact that it has split itself from life. It has split itself in some ways. So this is why I want to play with. This is why I prefer the Hegelian notion, because what what a Hegelian might say is, or what Hegel might say is, we don't argue or debate about how we should judge it. We just say, okay, let's look at how religion was perceived, right? And then how religion is looked at now. And basically, it's tantamount to saying, what do we know about religion now? To me, that's the Hegelian point, right? Or the Hegelian question. What do we know about religion now versus trying to do all this abstract thinking that may be unnecessary to some extent? Okay. And this is why I prefer Hegel's kind of method a little bit here, because I think, for example, when I'm still taking my religious theory class, people really did not like Freud's take on religion. Um, and it's funny because I think the Hegelian fear, right? The fear that Hegel had, and he talks about this in the introduction a bit, was that we would leave behind what failed, the knowledge of what failed, and we would dispose of it into a kind of like nothingness, right? It wouldn't. it would kind of just fall into a uselessness, basically, um, rather than making it for us in some ways. And what does that mean to make it for us? Um, and what does it mean to make Freud for us in his theory of religion? Um, you could say, I mean, again, I'm not like a master or like an expert on any of these people, but you could say that Freud adds something to the conversation about religion because we have to talk about desire. What are we desiring when we become religious? What are we desiring when we enter into a religion? And is that desire always the desire that we think it is? Um, so that's the thing that I would say that Freud adds to the conversation. Of course, religious theory would be like Freud thought religion was just bad. I mean, in some sense, yes, it's but there's certain readings of Freud, I think, or certain good misreadings of Freud you can give um, to understand that, or you can kind of put Hegel in Freud and say whatever Freud is advocating for us to get rid of, perhaps we should, right? But what's interesting is that I don't think religion will go away. Religion will just change, right? The religion, what we thought was religion, will now change into a notion, will become another object, like Hegel says, right? When the first object of knowledge fails, it transfigures and we have another object. And so religion will become now a new object. Um, so I think my my hunch is that this problem or this debate over the secularization thesis, are we becoming more religious, are we becoming less religious, I think what's happening, I think what the secularization thesis is saying or could be saying is religion is about to change. And by saying that religion is about to change does not imply that we are becoming less or more religious. It means it's taking another shape of consciousness. And to me, I think what secularization is, this fear of, is that sort of negativity, the negativity that cannot be avoided in some ways. The negativity, the Hegelian negativity that's coming or is already here. Um, so I would feel uncomfortable to say that secularization or the secular world is a religion, but I would be uncomfortable to even frame myself within these two dichotomies between religion and secularization. I mean, there is a point where we have to admit, I think, that even if we look back at like Roman religion, Greek religion, um, what what was what religion was for the Romans and the Greek was just life itself. That's the problem. That's the problem we find ourselves when we are now in the modern age, splitting ourselves into these notions of there's religion on one end and then there's secularization on the other end. But if we even entertain the idea that whatever religion was for the Greeks and the Romans, it was just life itself. Life itself was religion. But I think what happened, and this is probably the Hegelian interpretation, right? Or my Hegelian interpretation is that the notion of religion changed, perhaps from being life itself to a kind of more um, aspect of life. Um, and that's my concern, really is that religion now becomes an aspect of life versus a totality of life. And this is the problems that we start having, because when we start calling things religion, not religion, it's already predicated off that split notion of religion, a split notion of it being stripped away from life itself. Um, in some ways, this splitting obviously has a lot to do with the spirit of our time, meaning like, you know, people want to not be under a specific religion, right? This freedom of church and state and so on. Um, but yes, I mean, if you think about it, right, when religions like Buddhism or Christianity had more like a, like when Christianity, Buddhism, stuff like was the state, like it was the state religion, or so on, or was the country's religion. Um, you could say that it really wasn't a religion anymore. It was just life. Um, but now that the shape of religious consciousness went from state to state life to life itself, basically, where it was infiltrated through all areas, all aspects. Once that shift changes to another shape of consciousness about religion, now it has become more, you could say, more atomized. The shape of religious consciousness has become more atomized. You could argue this from even maybe a Christian standpoint. Zizek did this a little bit in The Monstrosity of Christ with Milbank, where he's talking about, at one point we had Catholicism, and then we started progressing into Protestantism. It's a kind of evolution of consciousness. Um, but I think there is room to entertain the idea that when we talk about religious consciousness becoming more atomized, I think there is good reason or good thinking to be had about the fact that Protestant consciousness played a role in that, um, played a role in freeing themselves from tradition and authority. Um, but if you look at now the trajectory we're going now, and why it's hard to talk about religion, and I think secularization is really just another way of saying that the shape of religious consciousness has become more atomized. Because what we see now, I think, with sort of capitalistic spiritualism, this is something Alex Ebert is good at talking about, um, and the notion of spirituality but not religious, the notion of spiritual, um, sort of disentangling themselves from religion entirely, right? But yet being spiritual in whatever that means. Um, so you can see how, if you follow like a Christian consciousness kind of point, like that Zizek will kind of go, you can see the shape of religious consciousness going from, let's just start it from like Greek and Roman, right? Greek and Roman religious consciousness was life itself. It just was consciousness. Okay. And then you start going into like Catholicism and the Protestant kind of, or actually it would be more Catholic Orthodox divide, but then Protestantism comes in, um, and it frees itself from tradition, and now it's more dependent on the self's interpretation of the Bible and so on and so on. Um, and then we're at this point in time where religious consciousness has shaped itself into perhaps denying itself, or to denying itself in the sense that it's no longer religious consciousness, but a sort of spiritual consciousness, um, which is interesting, right? It's interesting to show that shifting. Um, but this is what, if we're taking perhaps Hegel seriously, this is what a reading of Hegel might help us see how the shape of religious consciousness is leaving, is changing form here. Um, and it would seem that the more atomized religious consciousness is, it starts to give the impression that the world is becoming more and more secular and less religious. Um, but I think that it would just only exemplify the atomized, more individual atomized religious consciousness versus whether it's true or not that we're becoming more or less secular. I mean, that's one idea, but at this point, and I think that's why it's difficult to even talk about religion, and it's difficult to even, you know, be firm about the fact that secularization is a religion. I mean, in some sense, if we're talking back to Greek Roman, then it would just be life, right? Like we can just say it's just life. It's just life itself. Um, but because religious consciousness has become reduced to an aspect of life, um, I think that's where the discrepancy happens, right? And then secularization also is a way of dividing into an aspect of life, right? Um, and so we have this interesting, in our times, a kind of interesting split that we're playing with, right? We're like trying to grapple with religious pluralism in the midst of secularization. Um, and then there's like bioethics, and then against religious pluralism and their ethics. Um, so there is something fascinating to be said about the fact that in almost Hegelese, you could say we are encountering more and more often, because I think the phenomenology of spirit, it doesn't talk about the speed at which you would encounter or shatter your own notions. um, the sort of overloading or the excess of negativity that you can possibly encounter with with a world of pluralism. That's something to think about. The excess negativity that I don't think that Hegel could have possibly predicted, with technology and everything else. The question that haunts me, even if I take Hegel seriously, is how much is too much negativity, um, with the rapid notion that we are shattering our notions more frequently than perhaps ever before. And that's, I mean, there's problems with even saying that because it's I'm kind of privileging history a little bit here, or I'm privileging the current moment here. But I would almost say it would seem even more difficult going forward with the rapid notion of technology, these conversations about bioethics, AI ethics. I mean, are we ready to shatter our notions, our current knowledge about things? And how fast are we willing to endure that negativity of shattering that knowledge? Um, and that does seem for me, an interesting concern to have, is at what speed can we endure the brutality of negativity, otherness, big other, etc., etc. Um, but yeah, anyways, that's really it. Hope you guys take care.